delighted today to be speaking to David Wolfe QC, whom we instruct on many of our cases, especially environmental cases. And he's certainly one of the most tenacious, creative, and simply delightful barristers that we work with. And Chris Packham, who of course is a household name for his conservation work, broadcasting, and as well as that, he's one of our most treasured clients. And we thought it'd be interesting to bring you together because whilst you do very different day jobs, I think you probably work towards a common purpose and aim. And of course, your worlds collide in the cases that we act together and work together with. Chris, I thought we'd start with you. From the outside, it looks like you've dedicated your life really to environmental causes. And it'd be interesting to know why you've done that and what you think the most important thing you can do now with your skills and expertise.
Okay, I think the motivation, the fuel, if you like, is a very simple love for nature. When I was very young, I liked the perfection of nature, for the very simple organisms that I found around me, ladybirds that tickled my fingers and tadpoles. So I fell in love with that simple beauty. And initially, my fascination was to find out how it worked, how it lived. And so I studied zoology at university. I carried on from that point of 18 months through to 22 years. But by that stage, of course, we're in the early 80s, and alongside my fascination for the behaviour, the ecology, the physiology, had come a realisation that the world was in deep trouble. And conservation, at that point, you couldn't have had fascination without a desire to look after things, because we'd learned that they were very rapidly disappearing. And so in the past, I would have probably, buried myself in an ivory tower and studied wildlife for the rest of my life, but it wasn't really an option. I then felt compelled to try and help look after it. And of course, that was the early 80s. Here we are in the 2020s. Things haven't got that much better. And I carry a burden of guilt, not entirely personally, it's a generational thing. But in that period of time where I have not only been, passionately interested in, but concerned for the welfare of the world's wildlife, we've lost since 1970, when I got my first pair of binoculars, we've lost 68% of the world's wildlife. We've lost 90 million birds from the UK landscape. I've seen them disappearing in my lifetime. Not that the span of my lifetime has any relevance in the natural world, but that causes me enormous trouble, pain, and guilt. That's what it comes down to. So now at the age of 60 years, curiously, I'm trying to work harder than ever with my diminishing life expectancy to get things done at this critical and urgent time. So that's the motivation remains. It's that love for nature, the beauty of the way it all is linked together, the complexity and the functionality of it. But and I go back to that fuel to get motivated. But most of my time, I have to say, is not spent bird watching now. It's campaigning on behalf of birds.
And was it the crisis or the way nature was being diminished and affected that drove you to kind of have a public facing role rather than?
Yeah, I think so. I post university, I was, perhaps almost unemployable. I was massively into punk rock. I didn't look the part. I was highly energised and I was a very, very angry young man. But by that stage, I'd already recognised that although we punks used to say that anger was an energy, I had to harness that energy. I had to turn it into something creative. And I think I was fortunate enough to realise that at quite a young age. So although I was very angry, I was always thinking, right, how can I fix it? What can we do here? And part of a characteristic of my personality is that I've always had an aggravated sense of injustice. I don't like people getting away with things. I didn't like my sister getting away with things in the household where I got blamed for it, and certainly within the learning environment, the schools, colleges and things like that. When I saw other students getting away with things, replicating their data for their studies, just doubling the figures, not generating it in an authentic way, it really used to upset me. And so I suppose given that we have a judicial system, given that we have legislation to protect wildlife and the environment, when I see it being abused, that's red rag to my bull, really.
And David, you work within the justice system and you bring cases which try to stretch environmental law. You also do a lot of other cases, but what is it that you find so compelling about your environmental practice?
So environmental law has always been a part of the work I do. All of my work is what we call public law cases against public bodies. And I suppose when I started, it was probably about a third of my time. Now it's much more than that. That's really for two reasons. One is the less interesting version, which is that the regime around how the courts work and how court costs work means that actually environmental judicial reviews are oddly possible in a way that other ones are not because of the Aarhus Convention regime. But also it's because the problems involved are so significant. So other areas of public law touch on people's lives, of course they do, but there's nothing quite as existential as climate change or the biodiversity crisis. Those are irreversible, sort of intergenerational problems. Of course I'm concerned about other things in the world, but those just seem to be such big issues that it's worth concentrating on them.
And you've been bringing a number of cases with us for Wild Justice, and Chris, that's a group that you set up with Mark Avery and Ruth Tingey. Could you just talk a little bit about that and why you chose to come to the law and see if you could bring cases?
Well, again, being a 60-year-old impatient, angry, not so young man, and along with Mark and Ruth, we identified that the UK conservation NGOs weren't exploring all aspects of making progress in terms of looking after our environment, restoring it and regenerating it. And one gap that we saw, a vacant niche, if you like, was that they weren't fully exploring environmental law. And we had laws in place which weren't being implemented, upheld, and as a consequence, we sort of thought, well, let's give it a go. Let's start exploring what's there. I mean, at the outset, we didn't know. We had a broad understanding of the laws that had been drafted to look after our landscape and everything that lives in it. And we recognised some really significant things, that whether it was being abused, and what one of our principal, again, personal motivations is that we all feel aggrieved that our birds of prey are still being illegally persecuted. There's no ambiguity about the illegality, the criminality of that. So we thought, is there anything we can look into in the legal framework where we can make some progress here? Because the NGOs, through their educational schemes and so on and so forth, and all of the conversations they'd initiated with the people who were perpetrating these crimes or letting them get away with them, hadn't worked for decades. So that's what brought us together. And it's been joyous, because we found that it isn't just simplistic things like criminals getting away with persecuting raptors. There is a whole raft of legislation which is available for us to explore. No one else is doing it. It's just the three of us working with yourselves and David. And I think that for three people, I mean, I'm never one for blowing my own or our trumpet, but we have opened people's eyes to a whole different means of confronting some of the problems that we face, which, as David says, impact upon all of us. Mm-hmm. And I'm pleased to say that we've been going for about 3 years. Already people are beginning to mimic what we do. And that's fantastic. There are only three of us. If three more come on board and start to explore this in other ways, whether it's in the UK or elsewhere, job done. If we start a trend, then that has to be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, as a lawyer being on the cases, it has been phenomenally exciting to see, just because it was so new and innovative when we started doing the cases for you. And it's been great to see the effect that it's had on the landscape. How have you found it, David, as a
it's been a great period. I mean, working with the Wild Justice team has been a real new chapter in my professional life, and I've really enjoyed it. I mean, that they... not only do they bring the kind of open-mindedness to what sort of issues they want to be involved in, but also in terms of just how they work, how they make decisions, how they their nuanced understanding of how legal action can help in their campaigning work. It's a real breath of fresh air. And I think, for me, one of the odd things in this country is we actually have quite good environmental laws. It's not really for lack of environmental laws that we have problems with the environment, it's for lack of enforcement. And so the kinds of things that I've been able to do with Ruth, Mark and Chris are about getting that enforcement in place, whether that's pushing the Environment Agency or pushing Natural England or pushing the Secretary of State or whatever it might be. It's getting the good environmental laws we have actually to be enforced. And that's been a very productive, I think, process.
Yeah, because it seemed when we started that there were regulations in place, but they were never enforced. And it was almost like a black hole of law across the countryside. And that's been very interesting now to see that being activated and actually used in cases. And out of all the wild justice cases you've done, which one would be your favourite, or you feel that's had the most impact?
Well, oddly, the case or the series of cases that we've done together, which I think has been the most impactful, actually hasn't involved a great deal of going to court. It's been the stuff around the killing of wild birds under general licences. So that's the legal framework where people can go out into the countryside and shoot wild birds without even applying for a licence to do that. Now, when we first came to this, what is it now, 2 or 3 years ago, the licensing regime was very, very permissive. People were able to shoot all sorts of birds in all sorts of circumstances. And I think that's simply because nobody had really scrutinised that regime for 20 plus years. And so there was a whole load of stuff going on in there that as soon as we looked at it was obviously illegal. And the bizarre thing is that there must have been lots of lawyers in government, in NGOs, whatever, who'd looked at this and just never picked up on that. So you had this sort of 20-year, almost legal groupthink that had allowed this to go on. And Wild Justice has kind of jumped into the middle of that. Actually, one of the most amazing things was that almost at the first point where we said to the government, this is unlawful, they backed off and said, right, we see we've got a problem here. So that was a good example of how merely the threat of legal action can often bring change. And then it's still ongoing. We've still got cases involving that now going into Northern Ireland. A couple of years ago, the case was brought in Wales. As it happens, we lost the case in Wales, but that has, you can immediately see the impact, how that has happened, the impact of that on Natural Resources Wales, which is the regulator there. They have, in the aftermath of the case, massively improved their licensing regime. And that would simply never have happened had Wild Justice not brought that case. So, people who want to go out into the countryside and shoot wild birds, there's now a great deal less scope for them doing the kind of damage they were doing before, simply because of that series of legal interventions.
And Chris, how do you see the legal cases fitting within your broader campaign work? And have you learned any lessons from the last 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it expands the breadth of what we need to do. It questions people who are, enacting bad practice. From that point of view, it struck a chord, actually, as well, with the conservation fraternity. I think initially they were a little bit confused, but now having run through a few cases and had success, whether we win or lose, I mean, I think the key thing is, we did effectively lose that case, but we've won that battle because through having a conversation in public, we've instigated change. So I don't personally set off, and David and I have spoken about this. My end game is not standing on the steps outside a court with a big smile on my face. My end game is getting change. And if we can promote that through exploring these laws, basically giving them some public airing and some legal airing too, stimulating a conversation, which is sometimes acrimonious, but eventually has to be creative because changes have to take place, and we see these changes now taking place, then we've done our job. It's not necessarily about winning, it's about getting a result. And, what we like is that there is that flexibility of thinking within yourself and with David in the fact that there's a wider idea of how we make progress here. And we are making significant progress, and we've upset a lot of apple carts. And the key thing about upsetting an apple cart is that you've got to put the apples back in it, but that gives you an opportunity to think about how you put them back in it, which ones you choose and where you put them. And yes, of course, there are people that just want to load it up and carry on business as bad, bad business as usual, but we're making their life as difficult as we possibly can because effectively we are doing no more than asking them to change, to update their thinking. Laws that were put together more than 20 years ago are perhaps no longer relevant today. the world's moved on. There's far fewer birds, as we said at the outset of this. And as a consequence of that, reform, rethinking, and restructuring we should be doing it naturally. That doesn't happen naturally, so together we can stimulate it to happen, you know.
And about the long-term effects, have you, well, both of you really, do you think the decision-making of the public bodies, so Natural England, etc., is improving through this process? Not just on the particular cases, but more generally, with an awareness of the threat of litigation, I suppose.
I mean, one of the reasons I do this kind of law, which is challenging and scrutinising decisions by public bodies, is you actually generally improve the way they make their decisions. You know, over my 30 plus years in doing this, I've seen lots of examples, many in the environmental field, but in other fields too, of where cases win or lose, the public body then ups its game. It realises it's under scrutiny, it realises it has to explain itself. I think it empowers the civil servants, they're generally civil servants, to hold their ground within the internal discussions, things we may never see externally, but you absolutely see it. We see it, for example, just recently in Natural Resources Wales, where they have clearly shifted their position and upped their game in Wild Justice's minds, in the light of the scrutiny that Wild Justice has put them under. And that's got to be good for everybody. It's the rule of law. I mean, speaking as a lawyer, as opposed to an environmentalist, it's the rule of law.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the problems that we face is that some of the bodies that we're challenging are underfunded, under-resourced. Staff morale might be low. They may have lost key members of staff. The staff that remain are perhaps not always the people that we would like in that position to be enacting the changes that we're trying to stimulate. And they certainly are, and one of the things which is a particular aggravation to us is how easily influenced they are by exterior bodies. And that, again, from my personal point of view, smacks of injustice. And I have grave concerns about how powerful the lobbyists are when it comes to influencing them. So although sometimes we win, as it were, and we instigate change, there is a tendency, I fear, that they'll do everything they can to kick it into the long grass. Consultation is a word that,
Review.
Review, report. And we all know what that means. That means opening to access to those people who want to keep business as usual, and dragging that process of reform over as long a period as possible. And I've already spoken about our impatience with the plummeting populations and the critical state of the world. We need action now. We don't need it 10 years down the road. So, sometimes it is a sort of almost a Sisyphean task. You keep pushing the boulder up the hill, but then they roll it back down again. But we're not going away. We're full of fortitude and determination, and we'll continue to press.
What's the best way, and how do you change those levers of industry and lobbying, which seem like they'll always have the power because they've got the money? What can we, or what can the ordinary person do about that?
Well, I think it's public awareness. I mean, I'm not the only person that doesn't like people getting away with it. In wider life recently, we've seen a whole raft of people, not only in the UK, but around the world, getting away with things that we know are wrong. And they aggravate us. And ultimately, we will vote with the pens in our pocket. And if it's a political thing, every now and again, we get a chance to put a cross in a box. And people have good memories for being wronged. We don't like being wronged. We don't like being exploited. And as a consequence, I think, therefore, we have the opportunity, when we see justice being, found out, but not being implemented, then that gives us power to our elbow when we ask for reform of those bodies. I mean, when the bodies that we're thinking about, Natural England, Nature Scotland as it is now, National Resources Wales, so on and so forth, all of those statutory bodies, if I could magic wand, the first thing I do is give them more funding, which sounds ironic perhaps, given that we're in conflict with them quite often. But frankly, it would be good to be in conflict with a better team of people who are, wanting to implement the reforms that we're trying to initiate.
Yeah, and maybe fulfilling their statutory obligations or why they exist.
Exactly. The one thing that I do worry about, and it's a broader thing, is lobbying, And we don't have the access to those people that our adversaries do. And that's the simple reality of it. And that, again, is something that I find aggravating. I think that is unjust, basically. Mm-hmm. So the speed of change is problematic. But the fact is that you've got to try and you mustn't give up. I always say, winning is not giving up. It's never about getting a cup, crossing a line, getting a medal. Winning is simply just keeping going until you're gone and someone picks up the baton and carries on.
Got to be in it for the long haul. You got any comments on that, David?
Well, I think I just pick up on what Chris said about the sort of people and the organisations that we're often bringing cases against or challenging. I've never thought that they were evil people or evil organisations. Far from it. I think they are full of people who are absolutely committed to doing what those organisations are supposed to do, which is to strike a balance in relation to the environment. The difficulty is that if they are under-resourced and under pressure, they will face enormous pressure externally from organisations and people who would continue the damage to the environment. And what we do to some extent is come out from the other side and provide them with an alternative version, remind them what the legal position is and so on. I think we empower people within those organisations to make better decisions, to do what their organisations are up there to do, which is to protect the environment and strike the right balance. Without Wild Justice and other people, and a huge part of civil society as well, of course, being there to maintain that balance, then the voices that would harm the environment or not tackle climate change or whatever it might be will have the louder influence. And that's really what this is about.
Mm-hmm. Now, Chris has spoken about winning and what a win is. We all know that judicial reviews are notoriously difficult, and environmental judicial reviews particularly so. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about bringing cases that don't win? Does that, and sometimes, or how does that affect you if that's a part of your practice?
Well, I mean, in a sense, on a personal level, it's always nice to win, isn't it? But as Chris and I have been saying already, to some extent, the winning is in part of a longer framework. Very often you win in the long term, or the issue wins in the long term, even though the short term, the case itself might have been lost. So you have to see it in a bigger picture. That's definitely part of how one has to deal with those things. The other thing is, bear in mind that these are cases in which you're alleging a public body has broken the law. Now that's quite a big allegation to make. Public bodies are also quite good at, if they see the writing on the wall, giving in, and we've had that example with the general licences stuff, where when initially confronted with the proposition they were acting unlawfully, the Secretary of State Department immediately said, we've got a problem here, so that's good. So by the time you get to cases which are actually contested, they're always going to be the ones that are more marginal, more difficult. Yeah. So that's in the nature of the whole process.
And you must see your Heathrow case. That must be an example where, ultimately the Supreme Court didn't find in the favour, but...
Well, that's a good example of why when a client or whoever says to me, will we win? What are our chances of success? I say to them, well, how can I possibly answer that question? Because that case was, in the High Court we lost, in the Court of Appeal we won, in the Supreme Court arguably we lost. So how am I supposed to start at the beginning and say you're going to win? It's just not possible to give those answers, because public law, the issues we're dealing with, are not simple, straightforward, mechanical questions. We had 2 judges in the High Court who said no, 3 in the Court of Appeal who said yes, 5 in the Supreme Court who said no. I don't know what the maths is of that, but it just shows these are top judges who can disagree. So this is not easy stuff. Yeah.
Now, Chris, we are also acting for you in some defamation proceedings. And I wondered if you'd just speak a little bit about that case and why you're bringing it and what you hope to achieve with the case.
In order to sort of make progress, I need to be able to communicate with people, and I need to be able to do that with a degree of authority, in the sense I speak about nature and the environment, and they need to believe what I'm telling them about that. And I've worked a long time to make sure that I've protected my integrity and credibility. I'm not saying I'm perfect, by the way, and I'm not saying I'm the most authoritative person in that regard. But in order to communicate our wins and instigate that progress, I need people to do it. So we can take the cases, we can change people's minds, but then I need a larger number of people to actually do that, change their minds and make a difference on a bigger scale. So in order to be able to engage them, they need to be able to believe me. And trust is really important. And these days, we live in an era of fake news, and which is difficult to combat, almost impossible to combat. So I have to work constantly to make sure that essentially that I'm right and seen to be right. So that requires, from my point of view, considerable research. People ask me to work for them. In the old days, I might have said, well, yeah, that looks like quite good. Now, due diligence means I have to go through every aspect of their business. If someone sends me a social media request to help them on social media, perhaps for a campaign or something, I have to go into deep detail to make sure that it's the right thing to do, and maybe it might be the right thing to do but at the wrong time. So there are all these considerations to be made. I'm not overcautious in terms of protecting my reputation, but within that relatively narrow field, it's important. But there are people out there who obviously understand that importance and seek to undermine it. And every now and again, I think they cross a line. And their influence grows to a point where it becomes damaging. And it can be damaging a number of ways. It can have a financial impact upon me. And given that I put quite a lot of my personal monies directly back into conservation, I'm not a charity, I'm just an individual, but that's what I choose to spend the money I earn on. So that's problematic. The second thing is that I have to find employment. And one of the means of finding employment is that credibility, integrity and authority. I'm essentially employed as an expert in my field. There's always more expertise to be gained, of course. So there are those considerations. And in this instance, a number of people have insinuated quite serious charges. And when I was asked to Google myself, that's what I do normally, and I see that they're pretty close to the top of the list that anyone else looking to find information out about myself, potentially as an employer, potentially as someone who's questioning whether they should believe me or not, and I see serious allegations of fraud and misconduct and so on and so forth, I've got no choice but act. The allegations are entirely untrue, and they're being fabricated, I think, to an agenda, which is the erosion of my credibility and integrity. So I suppose it's you tolerate it up to a point and you let it go over your head. You need to be robust in my business and certainly resilient. But you get to a point where, unfortunately, you have no choice. They have to be pushed back over that line. And I think it's not just about these individuals, it's about sending a wider message to those people who seek to damage not just mine, but conservationists like me, our reputation, Mark and Ruth, so on and so forth. So again, it's one of those things where I feel I have to make a stand personally, but also on behalf of the fraternity.
The others, and I'm interested how the internet has impacted your campaigning work in good ways and bad, because it must have really transformed it.
It has, yeah, it is. And I have to say, in a majority of ways, it's positive. I can instantaneously communicate with a global audience of people who share my passions and my ideals. We can build communities, we can build interest, we can build concern very rapidly sometimes. And it gives us access to people instantaneously. Those people also access us and we learn from them. We learn of their concerns, we learn of their skills. It's a fabulous medium for communication. The downside is, of course, that open access, if you like, is free to everyone. And part and parcel of our everyday life now is that, certain people will use those platforms for nefarious means. And that's what happens. So yes, we get badly trolled, essentially. And it gets to a point where that can be damaging. Now, as an individual, I can be quite, resilient to that. I argue from, I think, a firm foundation of fact, so I feel secure. I never, I might stop to think, am I going about this in the right way? Or do my ideas need modifying? But the essential truth that I use as a platform for campaigning, I think, is robust. But these sometimes orchestrated campaigns, they upset the flow of communication. They upset my community. That they are disruptive. There's no doubt about that. And as a consequence, I think that we have to address them. And again, I feel for other people who perhaps don't have my determination and single-mindedness and 60-year-old resilience, particularly younger people, who are very, very negatively impacted by this sort of behaviour. And so later in the year, we are at the moment considering a campaign to address online hate, basically. But with a particular focus on how it impacts on young people, and maybe young people within the environmental campaigning sector as well, because it can be really debilitating. And I see people falling apart and getting very distressed, personally, professionally. It sets them back, and it causes enormous harm and suffering. So it isn't right. And again, my sense of injustice dictates that therefore we should do something about it, or try to do so.
And has the internet had any impact on your work?
I think the main thing about the internet, from my point of view, is it's given people enormous access to the information involved. So we now have much greater transparency around the way in which public bodies do what they do. It's much easier to find out how they work. I mean, when I first started 30 years ago, everything was a letter backwards and forwards. It was a piece of paper. It was a document. Things happened slowly. You couldn't discover. Now, if I want to find out how the Environment Agency is doing something, chances are most of the information is available there. I can search it, I can find it, you can look at it, you can move much more quickly. You can then share that with people. You can share it with campaigners and NGOs and so on. You can use it in your legal challenges. All of that, that simply wasn't possible 30 years ago.
Yeah, and I suppose for wild justice as well, it's the kind of the crowdfunding as well. You just wouldn't be able to do that kind of crowdfunding.
No. I mean, campaigning, when I started campaigning, I was handing out pamphlets, pieces of paper in the precinct. Yeah. Now we can disseminate that information instantaneously to a far greater audience, potentially receptive audience, with a lot more ease and pertinence. The one thing I will say, and that is that being a 60-year-old conservationist environmental campaigner, I've also recognised that that's not my skill set. And what we have to do is improve the way that we use these platforms, because I don't think we're maximising our capability in any way, shape or form. So I'm very keen to work with essentially younger, more able people who I always say they've already forgotten more than I know about the subject, and use their skills. And that's something that we haven't tapped into, I don't think, yet, as well as we could. Thankfully, our adversaries haven't either, but we really ought to take the lead on that.
And presumably, does that give you more confidence as well for, changing the status quo and changing the people who have the power and push the levers?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, I remain optimistic. We have a toolkit to fix things. We're not implementing it rapidly enough and broadly enough. And what we're trying to do is stimulate it in one particular way. We found a niche with wild justice. David's been working across a much broader spectrum of environmental concerns for some time, making significant progress, and most importantly, keeping the conversation live. Whilst all of those cases with Heathrow were going on, whilst our case with HS2 was going on, it was constantly being talked about. And if people are talking about it, they're thinking about it. And therefore, we can influence them to change their thinking. So these are not just legal platforms that are in play. These are conversations that we're having in the public domain. And I think that whilst we were challenging HS2, it gave us a fantastic opportunity to essentially disseminate information to a far broader audience of people about our environmental concerns. And although you might argue that we didn't win our case, we won the court of public opinion, because I think when we finished, there couldn't have been anyone in the land, straight-thinking, rational people, who didn't realise that this monstrosity needed to be rethought in terms of its environmental impact. And they might have come out agreeing with it still, and they might have still thought it was a good idea, but they knew there was an environmental problem. So we had lifted that way above the radar. And, again, we could have a conversation about was the final decision about refusing the judicial review a just decision? Is there justice in justice, if you like? But I mean, I came away from it thinking, yeah, great job done. Because ultimately there were lots of other conversations about this matter, economic, in terms of corruption, so on and so forth, not part of our agenda at all. But ours was very important for a significant proportion of the population who needed to essentially, if we were in a democracy, be backing that project. So I personally was very satisfied that we'd achieved an enormous amount in taking those challenges. And we had a realistic chance of winning. We weren't being wasteful in our practice in any way, shape or form. The judge could have found in our favour. But even though they didn't, we achieved a tremendous amount.
So there's a famous environmental lawyer called Phil Michaels who used to work at Friends of the Earth, and he had an expression in terms of judicial reviews. He said, he referred to the phrase, I don't know where this comes from, that sunlight is the greatest disinfectant. I have no idea where that came from, but he saw judicial review as having that effect. And I think the combination of judicial review and the internet is shining sunshine, shining a light on what public bodies do. And that is bringing out into the open the way they make their decisions, the decisions they make, who influences them, all of those things. And all of that, I think, is helpful. Because one of the historic problems about our state, our society, is things being done behind closed doors with behind the scenes unknown influences and all the rest of it. Yeah. So the more sunlight we can shine in the Phil Michaels kind of way on those things, I think the better it gets. And all of these decisions are about shining sunshine onto what the public bodies, which is what we're talking about, are doing. And then sometimes good things come from that.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's just great to be working with you both, and I think we can probably leave it there.
Well, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So as a client, how do you feel about the fact that the judicial reviews are few and far between, and since we started working together, there's been pressure to be even fewer of them, and those within the environmental sector it's a tiny percentage that we ever get?
So there aren't many environmental judicial reviews. Partly because historically organisations have been very reluctant to bring them because they've felt that there was a big risk of losing and having to pay enormous amounts of cost to the other side. And very often the other side is not necessarily the government body, it's a developer or a industry interest or whatever. And a whole load of cases. I remember a case I was involved in many years ago where the moment the judicial review was commenced, the company whose licence was under threat immediately said, first off, £150,000 of costs if you lose. Okay, now that was just literally a chilling effect on the NGO that was bringing the case. Now that has all changed enormously because of, technical term, the Aarhus Convention, which has just made it easier. It changes the rules on costs. The simple point. It makes it easier for environmental NGOs to bring these kinds of challenges, and that has made I won't say it's a game changer, but that has made it much easier. I don't think all of the environmental NGOs and so on have quite caught up with that yet. I think a lot of them are big organisations with long organisational memories, so they still have a historic reticence about getting involved in the kinds of things that you, Ruth and Mark, have been involved in. And I think, as you said, Chris, your activities have made them sit up and think, hang on a minute, maybe our historic anxieties about the role of judicial review and legal challenge were based upon a historic situation. So I think that's been a real incidental benefit of the work that you've been doing.
But we would like to see more judicial reviews covering environmental issues.
Well, we'd like to see more lawful government decision making. In a sense, I always think, we should,
to start with,
if we were doing our job properly, and the government bodies were doing their job properly, we wouldn't have a role. No. So in a way, it's one of those things. I always think there should be less of us. But in the short term, we need more of us. So we'll see where that goes.
Mm. The other thing is that I don't know how you feel, but you've done great work for us, and we're enormously grateful, of course, for that. But the progress is so slow. Even when we get a win, the win rolling out into the field where it makes a meaningful, practical difference can be so slow. And that I find that, again, aggravating. I almost feel like sort of shaking them and saying, listen, we've won, you've conceded, you've accepted that you need to change. Now please do it now.
Yeah, and change properly, not just tinkering around the edges.
Not tinkering around the edges and get on with it now. And I suppose all we can do to combat that is just to keep
I see it's just being against a big boulder, and you've just got to keep going.
Okay.
But it is hard. Yeah, it is. I think it is quite hard, that, isn't it? But
What makes you most satisfied? I mean, I'd never feel that I've done a great job because there's always I'm always looking at the next one, and so therefore there's never much time for any congratulations. Certainly no time for complacency. But
so, from my personal point of view, you always have to look forward. You can't be dwelling on what's happened in the past. You can't do anything about that. So you always look forward. And in terms of these kinds of cases and challenges, it's always about having lots of them on the go at once. So some of them will be struggling and feel like they're hard work and feel like you're not making any progress. But with any luck, you'll get some positivity elsewhere. And as you said, Chris, some of the timescales are enormously long. So you can bring a case, you can win or lose it. The ripple effect takes a year or 2 or 3 to generate some positivity. But as long as you've got enough of that going on, it's worth keeping going. But also, I think, at some extent, we're holding back the negativity, even if we weren't making positive steps forward.
Why does it stand still?
Because, frankly, if it wasn't for the scrutiny that is brought by Judicial Review on those public decision makers, those public bodies, they would become lazy and complacent in their decision making. And I was involved in some litigation 25 years ago with a series of cases against the Environment Agency about how they regulated cement kilns. The companies wanted to burn waste tyres, and that was potentially very polluting. We lost 3 big high-profile cases, but I subsequently bumped into the head lawyer from the Environment Agency who said those cases changed the way they made their decisions. They went away and they reflected. Even though they'd won the cases, they changed their internal processes. And that moment made it all worthwhile.
So effectively, even if we don't win, we scare them into action.
Yeah, which I think we are doing, because I think what happened while justice started, they just hadn't had anybody scrutinising their decisions for so long. They were making obviously illegal decisions time and time again. And now I think they are doing things more carefully. Now, that's not always with quite the right end, but the process is improving, I'm sure.
But it's also about the people who work in those organisations. I think very often we don't have direct communication with them. I think very often they value that external scrutiny. It makes their jobs feel more worthwhile. It makes them realise that they're not just beavering away at a desk in a corner. They are doing something which matters. People out there care about what they do, care that they make the right decisions. I think all of those things can only help those organisations and the people within them to function better. And that's got to be good for the general public process, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Sometimes I meet people who work for them. I'm always considerate, and I outwardly recognise the difficulties that they face, and so on and so forth. But once or twice in the last couple of years, some significantly high-profile figures in those statutory bodies have come up to me and whispered in my ear, "Thank you for making a noise, because it's made my job on council or as a trustee or whatever it happens to be a little bit easier."
I think that's right.
So that's good. And one last thing, we had a meeting yesterday and we've got some interesting new cases. So.
Oh, good. Excellent. Lots to look forward to then.
More work to be done.
Excellent. Okay, well, David, Chris, thanks ever so much for joining us, and we look forward to continuing to work with you as the days go by.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.